So, Starfield's officially been out for about a year now, and their first big DLC called Shattered Space just came out. And I don't know if you've heard the news, but it's not exactly doing so hot critically. And I mean, it's really not doing great. Even publications that gave the original base Starfield 8s and 9s and even 10s out of 10s are giving this new DLC 6s and 4s or even lower. It appears that while Starfield was very divisive, this DLC is somehow even more widely disliked by a much larger percentage of the fan base. Even the positive user reviews on Steam honestly feel pretty lukewarm at best. Like, I don't see a ton of people singing its praises to the heavens. Now, this video isn't just going to be another review dogpiling onto the DLC. I mean, I already hated base Starfield plenty. I don't know what would be achieved by giving Bethesda even more money so that I could hate on their DLC like everyone else is already doing. But here's the thing. Before the DLC came out, a lot of people, including myself to be fair, actually had somewhat high expectations for it. I mean, hell, a lot of people expected it to even be like a Phantom Liberty level turnaround for the game that would solve many of the issues that Starfield has, and I mean, let's be real here. In retrospect, I don't think that there is a universe out there where that was going to happen. And just to reiterate, I'm not trying to call anyone stupid for having these desires for the DLC. I myself brought into the hype at least a little bit. I always want new games to be good and for bad games to get better, but I want to stop and think about just why exactly so many people thought that this DLC could do so much to quote unquote fix Starfield and just how plausible that really was. So, first things first, I think that something a lot of people misrepresent when talking about Phantom Liberty and Cyberpunk in general is the state that Cyberpunk was in at launch. Now, don't get me wrong, at launch, the game was 100% an unplayable, buggy mess for almost everybody, and there were tons of performance issues and plenty of other problems. But I still think that despite that, the core of Cyberpunk 2077 was still a fundamentally pretty solid game. Like, the city was really well made and fun to walk around in. The combat was pretty fun to play through. The story was well written and had tons of fun characters with some very touching moments, and there were legitimately tons of positive qualities like that to take away from the game. It's just that nobody was really able to pay attention to those positive traits because they were distracted by glitches that caused the player to T-pose out of the roof of their car with their pants off. So while sure, there were definitely also some gameplay issues with things like random NPC AIs acting weird and the police chase system basically being non-existent, they still had a much more robust foundation to build off of. And as a result, once they fixed most of the major technical issues, the game was already in a pretty good state. So when they also added big updates to rework the progression system and add more combat options and things like that, that to me felt just like icing on the cake. They didn't have to do that to make the game good, it just took the game from good to excellent. And I don't mean to come off like I'm downplaying what CD Projekt pulled off there, but ultimately the context is very different when compared to Starfield. In order to address many of the complaints that people like me and many others were saying, they would have to fundamentally rebuild a lot of Starfield systems just from the ground up. Like, if the problem is that the game is as wide as an ocean, but as deep as a puddle because it has way too many procedurally generated planets and you can't even marginally and meaningfully explore most of them because all of the space travel is done through menu navigation and loading screens, these issues are fundamental issues with how the game operates on a basic programming level. The only way to meaningfully fix these problems would be to essentially rebuild most of the game's systems from the ground up. But I did just mention one big issue that some people thought the DLC might be able to address, which was procedural generation. The idea that I think a lot of people have in their heads is basically like, yeah, sure, the base game relied way too much on procedural generation, but if the DLC is going to take place in just a purely singular handcrafted environment, it'll surely be better, right? And again, even I bought into this line of reasoning for a bit, and that gave me hope for the DLC. But that's the thing. Does Starfield actually lean too much on procedural generation? Now, I know that that's probably sounds like a crazy thing to say. I mean, one of the core issues of the game is how insanely overly large in scope it is due to Bethesda thinking that randomly generating thousands of planets is somehow technically impressive. But let's stop and actually think about what it is they are actually making with procedural generation. When you go to a planet, there's usually a handful of locations that are pre-marked for you to land at, like New Atlantis and the other cities in the game. And from what I understand, these aren't actually procedurally generated at all. Maybe some of the terrain around the city is, but the city itself, where you actually spend all your time, is entirely handcrafted by actual level designers. You only enter the realm of procedural generation when you click on just some random place on the planet that isn't pre-marked like the cities. And if you do, the game will generate that portion of the world for you to explore. However, even then, this plot of land that you're sent to explore isn't fully procedurally generated either. When you eventually make your way to one of the various point of interests on the map, you usually find like a mining outpost or a science lab or whatever, and these buildings are individually handcrafted by real people. So when you land on a planet, the only thing that is actually purely generated in real time is basically the terrain itself and then the locations of the points of interest. The actual points themselves, while randomly chosen and positioned on the map, are individually handcrafted. This is why people often complained about running into the same cryolab over and over again on different planets and things like that. There's literally just like a handful of buildings that the system has to use to populate every single one of the thousands of planets in the game. The point I'm trying to get at here is that a lot less of the game is actually procedurally generated than many people, including myself, may have originally thought. It's actually a lot closer to things like those classic Radiant quests in Skyrim. You know, the ones where Todd claimed that you could do over like infinite quests, but in reality, it basically just looped the same 3 quests over and over again. It's basically just like that, except they're looping the same buildings over and over again on every single planet, and then using that to claim that their game is the size of a galaxy. So, like, if I'm being honest, I really think that Starfield would actually be better if it leaned more into procedural generation than it currently does. Like, if they had a system to generate outposts and actual buildings and waypoints on the fly, which I think they totally could have done with the building system that's already in the game, then at least we wouldn't be running into literal identical copies of each outpost multiple times in a row in each playthrough, and exploring planets would have a bit more variety to it. Though, of course, the opposite would also be valid solution as well. Instead of randomly generating thousands of planets, maybe just limit the scope of the game to like 3 star systems and a handful of planets each, so that they can be much more detailed and individually crafted. The main takeaway that I'm trying to get at here is that the problem isn't really the presence of procedural generation. They just implemented it in a really bad way that doesn't actually create unique points of interest or meaningful reasons to actually explore these planets. So this idea that the DLC would somehow improve upon the game by not relying so much on procedural generation is, I don't think, of as good as a selling point as it may have initially sounded. If the actual waypoints and cities themselves have been boring to explore for you, well, those are handcrafted, and there's not much of a reason to expect that more of these kinds of generic handcrafted areas would be any better in the DLC. And I mean, ultimately, it seems like that's the biggest issue with the DLC. The most positive reviews I can find for it basically just admit that all you get is a bit more Starfield, no more, no less. So the DLC seems to just reiterate many of the same issues with the base game. The companions and the interactions are very basically uninteresting, the writing is subpar at best and leaves a lot of wasted potential, and the gameplay is pretty much unchanged from the mediocre state it was in the base game. Now sure, for the sake of argument and curiosity, we could probably imagine a best case scenario for this DLC and just Starfield updates in general, a Starfield 2.0 if you will. If we're being realistic, there are absolutely some rough patches that could be fixed up in a big enough update if Bethesda really put their minds to it. Progression could easily be reworked to be less grindy and more satisfying, combat could certainly use an overhaul, and to give them some credit, we have gotten at least a couple of useful things like that car car update that made it so that now you only need to spend a couple of minutes driving to each waypoint on random planets instead of spending 10 minutes walking there on foot. And if they kept releasing big updates like that, the game would legitimately be left in a much better state. And of course, while I do think it's pretty unrealistic to expect an update that will rewrite the entire game's story to be more interesting and engaging, there's at least nothing stopping the DLC from being better written on its own and having more interesting characters, just like Far Harbor did for Fallout 4. But like I said earlier, there's also just a lot of fundamental issues with the game that no update or DLC like this could possibly resolve. The core appeal of most Bethesda games is being able to just wander and explore vast worlds and get immersed in a new setting, but they're not going to just magically release an update that somehow adds seamless interplanetary travel and gets rid of all the dumb menu navigation and loading screens. It would require way too much of a fundamental rework of the game's codebase and possibly engine tech from the ground up. So like, yeah, I definitely can see where many people are coming from with the hopes that the DLC could somehow turn things around. There are certainly some big things that could realistically be improved, and No Man's Sky and Cyberpunk have kind of been proof that it is possible for a game with a terrible launch to make a real comeback with the right team behind it releasing these kinds of big updates. But at the end of the day, I just don't think that Bethesda is that right team anymore. Like, and honestly, just looking at some of the interviews, and maybe this is a little mean to say, but I'm kind of starting to get some Concord vibes. Like, obviously, I can't know for certain what goes on behind closed doors at Bethesda, but with Concord, rather infamously, it recently came out from a few rumors and stories from ex-employees and whatnot that Concord's development was riddled with a sense of quote-unquote toxic positivity. Essentially, the idea that the people in charge of the project are so fully on board with everything and hyper invested in seeing it succeed that, like, yeah, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when it gets to the point where you believe in something's greatness so hard that you refuse to listen or acknowledge any criticism against it, it naturally leads to mistakes and bad decisions being overlooked until it's far too late to correct them. And I can't help but get the same idea from some of these interviews that Bethesda are having a fairly inflated sense of grandeur when it comes to their own projects. They call Starfield literally the biggest, richest space simulation RPG that anyone could ever imagine. And I mean, like, of course they're going to talk themselves up a bit for PR, but like, come on, Bethesda. In a world with Mass Effect, The Outer Wilds, No Man's Sky, that Rogue Trader RPG, KOTOR, I can keep doing this for hours. Do you really think that your loading screen simulator offers a richer and deeper space exploration experience than anything we've ever seen before, let alone that we can imagine? Like, they also literally said things like that they've supposedly thought about DLC more than any other studio, as if they've released the best DLCs of all time, which again is a pretty wild thing to say in a world where we have things like The Witcher 3's expansions and Shadow of the Erdtree and whatnot. And sure, I mean, they're not all directly comparable, but like Shadow of the Erdtree only costs a whopping $10 more than Shattered Space, but DLCs like that and Phantom Liberty and so many others like them just completely blow Bethesda's latest work out of the water, both in terms of quantity and quality of content, that the idea that what Bethesda has done here is even approaching the same level as these other games is frankly laughable. And I can't help but feel, as a result of these kinds of insane statements, that maybe Bethesda just isn't being self-critical enough during development. So many of the issues Starfield has are things that 100% should have been able to be called out internally before release. To give them some credit, a few of these interviews do mention that they are trying to listen to feedback. They explicitly mention that things like the new difficulty options and the land vehicle mechanics were added to the game as a direct response to player feedback, and that's good that they're doing that to at least some degree. But if you ask me, it probably shouldn't have taken the game being fully released to the public for someone on the inside to point out that maybe it isn't fun to just mindlessly walk across a barren landscape for upwards of 5 to 10 minutes before reaching any meaningful content every single time you touch down on a random planet. I'm more than 100% certain that someone brought up issues like this and the loading screens and the menus and tons of other problems like that internally long before release, but it's increasingly sounding like these criticisms were probably shot down and downplayed until it got to the public, at which point it became impossible to ignore, and then suddenly Bethesda's put on the back foot as they suddenly rush to try and acknowledge all of these very obvious problems. It doesn't take a genius to take one look at what this DLC was offering and what price it's being sold at and see that it clearly was not going to live up to the standards that have been set by so many other games in recent years. I mean, hell, even compared to Bethesda's own standards, I still don't think that this DLC lives up to expectations. Far Harbor, which they really wanted to convince people this DLC would live up to, cost $5 less on release, offers more content and way more interesting content that is of a far higher quality, and it only took them 6 months to release it after Fallout 4's launch, and that was after releasing 2 other DLCs, and then they still released Nuka World on top of that well before the game was even a year old. Essentially, Bethesda feels like they're getting objectively worse at their job. It is taking longer to release content, the content is mediocre at best and doesn't do anything to meaningfully improve upon the base game, and they expect to be able to charge more for their lack of effort. It's the absolute worst of all worlds, and I think that people are getting fed up with them. So yeah, to try and wrap this up a bit, sure, maybe if Bethesda really buckled down and got their act together, this DLC could have improved at least some aspects of the game and reached the level of like a Far Harbor by having a better written, self-contained story and setting and whatnot. And ultimately, despite everything, I think that it was fair for many people to have at least some high expectations for this DLC. Sure, like I said, there's no way the DLC would address things like the real fundamental problems that the game has. So I think that anyone who thought that it was going to do that was probably being unrealistic, but it could have at the very least been a good self-contained experience that stands out above the main game by addressing what few problems it could have realistically tackled. And I think that Bethesda's fans are in the right for expecting at least that much from them. But they couldn't even pull that off anymore, let alone address the myriad of larger issues with the game. I know I've said this before in my older videos, but I really think that Bethesda needs to take a step back and take a long, hard look at itself, because they can't keep going at this pace that they've been going at recently. I don't know if they need to fire some higher-ups or do a major restructuring of the company or whatever, but something needs to change, or else Elder Scrolls 6 is going to be the next on the chopping block, and nobody wants to see that. But as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. What were your expectations leading up to the release of Shattered Space, and do you think that there is anything Bethesda could do to salvage Starfield at this point, or should they just move on? And well, if you liked what you saw and want to help the channel out, make sure to like and subscribe and ring the bell to get notified of when I make more videos in the future. And if you really want to help out, you can also donate to my Ko-Fi to help me keep doing what I'm doing. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.